Hello, and thank you for agreeing to be interviewed for Land Talk, which is a citizen science and environmental history project that documents how local landscapes change over time through these intergenerational interviews. So thank you. And first, can you tell me your name and where you are from?
It's my pleasure to help you and be part of this class and be part of the interview, Adrian. My name is Chris Willems, and I am a science teacher in New Haven Public Schools, ninth grade, Metropolitan Business Academy, which is not too far from where I grew up in New Haven.
And can you tell me the neighborhood you grew up in?
Yeah, it's Fairhaven. It's the part of Fairhaven that is on the eastern side of the Quinnipiac River. It's also known locally as Fairhaven Heights.
Mhm. And how long have you lived in New Haven, and are you still connected to it today?
So I lived in New Haven from when I was born in 1967 until I left for college in 1985. Um, and I'm still connected because I moved back to New Haven when my father died in 2001 or 2002. And I moved back partly to help my mom. I'm the only child of that marriage, and she still lives in the house that they bought when I was 6 months old.
Wow. Yeah, definitely. And even, through being a teacher, you still also have a connection that way. So thank you for sharing that. And can you describe to me how Fairhaven or New Haven as a whole used to look way back when you were growing up?
So growing up, my memories are primarily from the 1970s on. I don't remember being a baby.
Mhm.
But when I was 6, 7, 8 years old, a lot of businesses, especially along Grand Avenue, which is the main thoroughfare that goes from Fairhaven right into downtown New Haven, where Elm Street is. It runs out to Grand Avenue. Yeah, a lot of small businesses. Actually, in Fairhaven, so my folks were actually both teachers as well. They taught in Hamden, lived in New Haven, and they could barely afford the house that we bought. They had to get a second mortgage on it, and we were always doing the work ourselves. And I bring this up because an important part of the neighborhood was having not one, but two local hardware stores that were both walking distance. One was on our side of the river, that was the New England Hardware, and the other side of the street was the Roland T. Warner Company, which was also a hardware store. So when we needed parts to fix our house, because we were doing all the work pretty much, except for the more complicated electrical work, other people were doing it. We had a choice of two stores to go to that were literally about a half a mile from the house. So that was one of the main features I remember. I remember going to small businesses with my dad. My dad used to smoke cigars, and I remember going to another store where he would get the newspaper and pick up cigars, and memories from like the Nixon administration, and Nixon being impeached, and there was a Firestone store. There was just a lot of community activity, even while there was a lot of movement away from the city at the time. There were the a lot of immigrant families had sort of made more money, and so they were moving out of town. But it was still very not I shouldn't say still, because it is. It was changing, as cities do. But that's really what I remember so much about it back then, is really you didn't have a lot of national stores. They were all sort of locally owned, locally operated stores, and a real great community feel that you still have. It's just changed.
Yeah, so you talked about community and business. Do you remember anything about the nature, any specific, maybe like animals or
Oh
trees or?
yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, you know me. I was always outside whenever I could be. School really wasn't my thing. Surprising, I'm a teacher. But I love being down along the river, especially. I was constantly fascinated by the fish that you could see. I saw one day I was fishing down there, and I saw um, what is it? So with the really beautiful tiger backing on it. Mackerel, actually followed in my lure. It had this, in the water, they had this gorgeous coloration. And there were bluefish. In fact, it's one of the best places in the East Coast to catch bluefish. It was actually right along the river there. And all the menhaden or bunker, which are filter feeder fish that follow them. I would constantly play along the sides of the river, around the bridge. And we had really nice parkland over there too. There's a big Fairmont Park on the right behind the Quinnipiac School, which had lots of woodlands, and we were constantly, my friends and I would constantly explore and build forts and things like that.
Hmm. And can you describe how Fairhaven or New Haven as a whole has changed since then?
Uh, well, more recently, it's become much um, much more attractive to people. Especially in certain parts of town, and actually along the river. When I was a child, those houses were not crazy expensive like they are now. You could actually, a regular family could afford one of those houses. Now they're incredibly expensive. Anything that you can see the water from is incredibly expensive. So the population has changed a little bit. The houses have changed. They've gotten bigger and fancier. In some cases, in other places, we've seen the development of more apartment buildings in different parts of town. Um, I would say that the park system in New Haven has really sustained, maintained, and even expanded the quality of the offerings. The trails are a lot better now. The civic engagement with the parks is much better than it was when I was a child. There really wasn't that much interest. The Earth Day was brand new back then, and the environmental movement was just starting.
Hmm.
Oh, one thing I do remember that's really important: the Mill River actually had an active mill on it, a paper mill. And it was disgusting. The water was like gray and it smelled like sulfur. It smelled really, really, really bad. I remember my dad and I once went out fishing with a bunch of black men on the porgy special because they love to fish for porgies. And we were the only white guys on the boat, only white people, they're only men. And we left from the Mill River where the power plant was. And I just couldn't believe the water was gray. It stunk. And I know now that it was because of a paper mill. So that is one example of the industry disappearing, which has left a much cleaner river behind.
Wow, that's fascinating. Mill River, I didn't realize there was, such a polluting mill that was there. So that sounds like a good change that has been discontinued. Have there been any major storms since from when you grew up to now?
Yes. Yeah, there have been numerous. There was back in the mid 1980s, there was a Gloria hurricane that came through. But then more recently, we have had Irene and Sandy, that have both done significant damage to our coastline, and then these other, freak snowstorms, in October that we've had past couple of years, and these summer windstorms and these tornadoes that have touched down locally and windstorms. No, the storms have definitely increased in frequency and severity.
Hmm. And do you notice any changes in like the weather or the landscape over these past decades?
Well, I'm a gardener, so I do notice that, like, for example, we just had our first frost 2 nights ago, Friday night. And normally, when I was your age, a little bit younger and doing Halloween, there would be leaves would all be down by the middle of October. We would have had our killing frost earlier in the month of October. So that's a big shift that I've noticed. And I found also I can start my plantings earlier in the spring. Normally I can't put the cold weather things in until June, but now it's moving back to May. And a lot of other stuff that's tolerant of the cold I can start in March. So I'm definitely seeing an extension of the growing season, which is good for a gardener, but as an environmentalist and a conservationist, it's terrible news.
Mhm. Yeah. Is there anything you miss that maybe isn't here anymore from when you grew up, or maybe, something you like that is here that wasn't there when you grew up?
So I really did not like taking the school bus to school for a number of reasons I won't go into right now. So I started riding my bike a lot to school from Fairhaven over to Wilbur Cross. And one of the things that I would do just to sort of clear my head is I would ride my bike to the top of East Rock. And one of the parts of the road, the old carriage trail that goes to the park, would go through a gorgeous forest of hemlock trees, pine trees. And interestingly, in the 1980s, and I've heard, I haven't researched it totally, but I've heard that as part of that Hurricane Gloria and other storms, this little insect called the adelgid was swept up north here and did a really good job of colonizing these trees. They're all gone. They're all dead. All you see now are just the stumps. They couldn't survive the influx of these teeny microscopic mites that just slowly over time eat their sap and weaken them. And you just see a little bit of white powder at their waist, but otherwise you don't see much. And after a couple of decades, they're all gone. So I definitely miss those trees. They were beautiful, and it was always very cool and moist in that part of the East Rock Park. And now it's there are emerging trees coming up, but it's a very different habitat.
Wow. Yeah, that is actually very fascinating. And so to pick up again on the businesses that you mentioned, there were a lot of small businesses when you were growing up. Do you believe the business kind of scene has changed, or community kind of scene has changed since when you were growing up?
It's changed, but it's just different. So when I was a child in Fairhaven, there was a growing Puerto Rican and Mexican population, which now dominates Fairhaven. I was sort of in the transition, from more Italian to the Central American and Caribbean island, Pacific, Dominican, Mexican, and as with all change, though the new immigrants now own many of those businesses. Although it feels when I'm in the community that there are many small family restaurants and things like that. But as part of the national or international move towards monopolizing markets, a lot of the smaller non-restaurant businesses seem to be more chains and less individually owned. For example, there are no family-owned hardware stores, near and dear to my heart, as you can tell, are hardware stores. There's a Lowe's, there's a Home Depot, but there's very few other independent businesses like that around here.
Mm-hmm. And so you mentioned playing outside a lot as a kid. What are some of the things that you used to do in Fairhaven growing up?
So in addition to fishing, we built rafts once. It was a disaster because the wind blew us across to the marsh and we couldn't get back without getting towed by a big boat. um, we would do a lot of tree climbing. We would do a lot of just messing around, riding our bikes around. We would build BMX bicycle riding was popular back then. So we would build little trails in the woods and little jumps. We would really just spend a lot of time just sort of exploring. We would dig underground forts and cover them up. We would take trees and make lean-tos and cover them up with whatever materials we could find. I mean, we were pretty feral kids. We were not inside until we had to be.
Mhm.
And we loved it because there was just so much to do there. There was a river, there were big parks, and we kind of got to set our own rules.
That's awesome. And what are some of the things that you do in Fairhaven now? Or is it still possible to do a lot of these activities, or maybe they're not possible anymore? I'd like to hear about what you do now.
I love the neighborhood. In fact, so I live about 9 miles away, and still am an avid bike rider. So I when the weather's nice, when I want to visit my mom, and I visit her, several times a week. I try to get there at least every other day, and I call her all the time. She's 88. I ride my bike there. And so I love riding around the neighborhood. It's a beautiful part of town. I mean, the whole town, I love the whole city of New Haven. but I ride in along the river. I walk around that Fairmount Park. There's the trails there are still fantastic. In fact, it's one of the things I'm thinking about doing this spring. If we are able, depending on what happens with the coronavirus, I'd like to meet kids in the park and have a small group, social distance, and do it in different parts of the town. Um, there are a lot of people who do what I do. They walk around the neighborhood. There's a whole loop that goes around between the Ferry Street and the Grand Avenue Bridge. They're fixing the Grand Avenue Bridge right now, but it's a big walkway that people walk around there. And to be honest, a lot of the time that I spend there, I'm working on my mom's yard because my dad was a gardener too. So she's got a pretty good sized garden and yard. So I'm actually kind of grounded to the earth at her address and doing a lot of work there. um, working in that yard that I'm familiar with because I've been around it for 52 years.
Hmm. And what do you miss most about living there?
Um, I miss the diversity. I'm from New Haven. I lived in the Boston area for about 10 years, in Somerville and Medford and places all around there. I really miss seeing lots of people from lots of different backgrounds. It's here, in the suburb of Brantford where I live, but there's much less. The reality is it's mostly white, and it's it's not what I come from. It's not what I'm used to, right? Um, when I'm at school, I feel much more comfortable because I know that I'm around a lot of folks um, who are open to lots of different ways of thinking and looking at the world. And I don't always feel that that's true for where I currently live. So that's something that I miss the most. I do love that um, that neighborhood in particular is the American success story. That people have come to this country and they've established uh, resilient and healthy communities, and they're making it work. Um, I just wish it wasn't in this particular political context of fear and hate. Um, but again, that's the value of community, is they're able to resist a lot of this by being together.
Hmm. Well, thank you so much for sharing more about Fairhaven, and telling me all about the history of it and what you do now and how it's changed you. So, thank you so much for your participation.
It was fun. I enjoyed taking a trip down memory lane.